Trump adopted tariffs as his tool for pressuring Beijing to come to the negotiating table to address the aforementioned bilateral trade imbalance. When it was put to him that punitive tariffs tend to lead to trade wars, he said, quote, "Trade wars are good and easy to win." Between 2018 and 2019, he introduced tariffs on some $380 billion worth of goods imported from China, including machinery, electronics, and consumer goods, with rates ranging from 10% to 25%. Chinese industry leaders called the move, quote, "stupid," and Beijing retaliated with tariffs on $110 billion of US exports, targeting agricultural products, automobiles, and energy. This hit the US economy hard, particularly in agriculture. Now, many US farmers are dependent on exporting to the Chinese market, particularly in the soybean, corn, and sorghum industries. However, China can substitute imports of US agricultural products from less hostile countries, like Brazil, more easily than the US can find alternative markets for its agricultural goods. This has made US agriculture a low-hanging fruit for China's retaliatory tariffs. Predictably, America's market share of key agricultural goods like corn and soy fell, and the federal government was forced to use almost all of the revenue from its China tariffs to pay for a massive $61 billion bailout for US farmers. So, by this point, it was clear that the trade war was significantly hurting the American economy without solving the underlying economic concerns that it was meant to resolve. It failed to reduce America's trade deficits, as tariffs on China merely diverted trade flows elsewhere, causing the US trade deficit with Europe, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to increase as a result. A partial truce was reached in January 2020 when China agreed to increase imports of manufactured goods, agricultural goods, energy products, and services from the US to above their 2017 levels by the end of 2021. In exchange, the US agreed to negotiations to reduce the 2018 tariffs. However, the onset of the pandemic and a housing market crisis put China's economy on ice that year, and it fell short of its commitments under the January 2020 agreement. The tariffs remained in place, and Trump passed the trade war baton to President Biden in 2021. The Biden administration was no less hawkish on China, but instead of trade deficits, its rationale for continuing the trade war was to stunt Chinese technological capabilities. Biden increased Trump's China tariffs, which had ranged from 7.5% to 25%, to a new range of 25% to 100%. He also introduced new tariffs covering even more imports from China. The Biden administration raked in $144 billion in tariff revenue as a result, significantly more than the $89 billion that was collected by the first Trump administration. Now, since tariffs are a regressive form of taxation, they were in part to thank for the spiraling costs of living and inflation that has clobbered ordinary Americans in the post-pandemic era. Well, you know what they say.
No pain, no gain.
So, what did the Biden administration gain by continuing the trade war? Remember, under Biden, it was no longer about any trade deficit, but about maintaining America's lead over China in the development of strategically important technologies like AI and high-performance computing. To accomplish this, Biden added to the trade war strict new export controls on critical technologies. These aimed to choke off China's access to the future of AI and high-performance computing by restricting access to advanced GPUs and to prevent it from obtaining or domestically producing alternatives. Well, it's a good thing they waited until Biden was out of office to release DeepSeek R1, because that could have been seriously embarrassing. If you remember that whole episode, you'll recall that the moral of the story was necessity is the mother of invention, and indeed, innovation. If anything, Biden's version of the trade war seems to have spurred more innovation and progress in China's development of the technologies that will define the 21st century. Meanwhile, Beijing did not take Biden's escalations lying down. After Biden banned the export of advanced US microchips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, Beijing responded with export bans of its own. Specifically, it banned the export of critical minerals that the US depends on for a wide range of advanced civilian and military technologies spanning defense systems, semiconductor manufacturing, energy transition, and space exploration. Now, this is quite a big problem for the US because China controls around 60% of global production and 85% of processing capacity for critical minerals, which the World Economic Forum has described as the, quote, oil of the 21st century. And unlike how China was able to simply buy soy from Brazil instead of the US, it's not easy for the US to establish alternative supplies of critical minerals. If you saw our recent video about Trump's apparently sincere attempt to conquer Greenland and Canada, you'll know that the US is prepared to go to extreme lengths to secure new supply chains for the critical minerals it can no longer source from China. You'll also know that the Ukraine minerals deal that's been in the headlines recently is not a solution to this problem. The deal has more to do with building up Ukraine's military than the US securing supplies of the critical minerals it most needs, of which Ukraine is not known to have commercially viable deposits. So, with no quick fixes available, China's dominance of the global supply of critical minerals will continue to provide Beijing with significant leverage. So, with President Trump's return to the White House, the US is now on its third rationale for waging a trade war with China. First, it was about trade fairness, then it was about semiconductors and AI, and now, what was it again? Yes, fentanyl. From Trump to Biden and back to Trump, the list of reasons for imposing tariffs on US imports from China has become broader and less focused, moving well beyond addressing international trade issues. The inconsistent trade policy coming from Washington leaves Beijing with no clear path to take to get out of the crosshairs. As a result, patience is running out in some quarters of the Chinese government. Recently, the Chinese embassy in the US made headlines in the Western media after it tweeted, quote, "If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end." Now, this was an unusually blunt statement from Chinese government officials, and it made for some exciting headlines. Indeed, Beijing is well positioned to weather whatever trade war shenanigans Trump has up his sleeve. After almost 7 years of increasingly erratic trade warring, China has de-risked from its prior interdependence with the US economy. Exports to the US now account for less than 3% of China's GDP, and China trades far more with countries in Southeast Asia than it does with the US or the EU for that matter. However, if there is any appetite for a kinetic war in Beijing, they're keeping awfully quiet about it. Speaking at China's recent two sessions, Beijing's annual political summit, Foreign Minister Wang Yi reiterated the same old party line. Quote, "It is fully possible for China and the US to become partners, helping each other succeed and prosper together." This is the same message President Xi delivered at the last major US-China summit in 2023. As he put it, quote, "Planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other. For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides." Now, regarding President Trump's latest tariff escalation, Wang Yi has urged the US to reflect on what its trade war has accomplished thus far. Quote, "Has its trade deficit widened or narrowed? Has its manufacturing become more or less competitive? Has inflation gone up or down? Have the lives of its people got better or worse?" Now, the language used by China's leaders contrasts significantly with that of their US counterparts. President Trump famously accused China of, quote, "raping our country," while President Biden called President Xi a, quote, "thug" and a, quote, "dictator." According to new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Trump's latest recruit from the Fox News host to White House pipeline, China wants to, quote, "supplant the United States," and this is why he is, quote, "re-establishing deterrence in the warrior ethos." Specific objectives of the second Trump administration's foreign policy remain unclear, but based on recent developments, we think the US may be about to attempt a reverse Kissinger maneuver. If Trump can patch over things in Ukraine and bring an end to the war there, then he'll be free to leverage his rapport with President Putin to try and peel Russia away from China, isolating the latter just as former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger did with China following the Sino-Soviet split of the 1970s. By contrast, The centerpiece of China's foreign policy is not the projection of communist-themed military supremacy around the globe, but an infrastructure investment project to build new trade routes connecting Asia with Europe, Africa, and Latin America. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, which President Xi says is designed for win-win cooperation and the mutual benefit of China and participating countries. At the top of the BRI agenda is the pursuit of economic globalization, multipolarity, and cultural diversification. And this has proven very popular. China has lent more than $1 trillion to build roads, ports, railways, airports, and other public infrastructure in developing economies. More than 152 of the world's 195 countries have now signed deals with China under the BRI, covering 75% of the world's population and 40% of global GDP. Western critics have characterized this as insidious debt trap diplomacy, but with little evidence. The case of Sri Lanka is a primary example, where China was accused of a devious plan to lend Sri Lanka money for a major new port, only to have Sri Lanka default on the loan so that Beijing could seize the port for use as a new naval base in exchange for debt relief. This case depends on ignorance of basic facts about the port and Sri Lanka's debt distress. For example, the port was proposed by former Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa under a corrupt and unsustainable developmental program. Sri Lanka's debt distress was unconnected to Chinese lending, instead arising from excessive borrowing from Western-dominated capital markets and structural problems in the Sri Lankan economy. The port will become the new base of Sri Lanka's Southern Naval Command and cannot be used by Chinese naval vessels. It seems nefarious practices like China's mythical debt trap diplomacy are needed to justify hawkish US foreign policy, which needs a threat for American power to deter. And at the moment, the US has built up an antagonistic posture so fixated on an eventual showdown with China that de-escalation seems unlikely anytime soon.